The hammer fell with a sound like breaking bones, echoing across the dusty courthouse square of Cedar Ridge, Montana. What happened next would haunt the town for generations, not because of the cattle sold or the farmland divided, but because of the elderly woman who stood on that auction block, dignity intact despite the shame burning around her like wildfire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Claire Whitfield had raised 5 children in this town, buried 2 husbands, and saved more lives than the local doctor. But on that scorching August afternoon in 1923, she became lot number 47, sold to pay her nephew's gambling debts to the highest bidder. The mysterious cattle baron who raised his and wasn't just buying a woman. He was settling a debt 23 years in the making. A debt that began with a blizzard, a dying mother, and a young woman who chose compassion over fear when the rest of the world had given up hope. The Montana sun blazed mercilessly that Tuesday morning, turning the courthouse square into a furnace that baked the very souls of those gathered. Dust devils danced between the makeshift pens where livestock shifted restlessly, their eyes glazed with the same resignation that seemed to infect everything in Cedar Ridge these days. The drought had lasted 3 summers now, cracking the earth like broken promises and driving more families to ruin than anyone cared to count. Margaret Claire Whitfield sat motionless in the back of her nephew's wagon, hands folded in her lap, with the practiced stillness of a woman who had learned that dignity was sometimes the only possession they couldn't take from you. At 72, her back remained straight as a lodgepole pine. Through the years had carved deep lines around her grey-blue eyes. Those eyes had seen the town of Cedar Ridge grow from a handful of tents to a proper settlement, had watched children be born and buried, had witnessed prosperity and poverty cycle like seasons. Her dress was her Sunday best, navy blue with small white flowers, mended so carefully that the patches had become part of the pattern. She wore her late husband's watch chain around her neck, the gold tarnished but unbroken, and her silver hair was pinned beneath a hat that had once been fashionable in Helena, back when she could afford such luxuries. Thomas Whitfield, her sister's boy, paced beside the wagon like a caged animal. At 35, he carried himself with the nervous energy of a man perpetually one step ahead of his mistakes. His clothes hung loose on his frame. Gambling had a way of eating not just a man's money, but his flesh as well. Red-rimmed eyes darted constantly between the crowd and the courthouse steps, calculating odds, measuring risks, counting the minutes until his debts would either be settled or become his grave. "Aunt Maggie," he said, his voice carrying the wheedling tone she'd grown to despise, "you understand this ain't personal, it's just business. Just temporary-like." Margaret didn't acknowledge him. She'd said her piece 3 days ago when he'd first proposed this abomination. There were other ways to settle debts. The farm could be sold, his few remaining possessions auctioned. But Thomas had already mortgaged the land twice over, and his creditors wanted blood, not promises. The crowd grew thicker as the morning wore on. Ranchers from as far as Billings had made the journey, drawn by news of prime breeding stock and fertile land going cheap. But word had spread about Lot 47, and that drew a different sort of attention. Some came out of morbid curiosity, others from a twisted sense of entertainment. A few arrived with genuine concern, though none with pockets deep enough to make a difference. Sheriff Ben Morrison stood near the courthouse steps, his badge catching the harsh sunlight. He was a good man caught in an impossible situation. What Thomas was doing wasn't technically illegal, just morally bankrupt. Adult children and relatives had been caring for elderly family members this way for generations, though usually with more discretion and less public humiliation. The law saw it as a practical arrangement for those who couldn't care for themselves. The law, Margaret had learned, was often a poor substitute for decency. as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, selling off livestock and equipment. With the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd long since stopped seeing the human cost of his work, Margaret allowed her mind to drift to better times. She remembered when Cedar Ridge was young and full of promise, when her first husband Jacob had built their cabin with his own hands, and she delivered half the babies in the county. She remembered the influenza outbreak of 1901, when she'd turned their home into a makeshift hospital and worked 18-hour days nursing the sick back to health. She remembered Sarah Blackwood. The memory came unbidden, as it often did during her darkest moments. 23 years ago, in the brutal winter of 1900, when the snows came early and stayed late, when the temperature dropped so low that breath froze in the air and livestock died standing up. Sarah Blackwood had been just 16 then, alone, except for her dying mother and a baby who wouldn't stop crying. They lived in a soddy 15 miles out of town, too far for help when the storms hit. Margaret had been the only one willing to make that journey through the blizzard. Others had called her foolish, reckless, and said the Blackwood women were as good as dead already and had no sense in losing another life to the storm. But Margaret had wrapped herself in buffalo robes, hitched her strongest horse to the sleigh, and fought her way through drifts taller than a man to reach that little sod house on the prairie. What she found there had haunted her dreams for years after. The baby was blue with cold, Sarah's mother delirious with fever, and Sarah herself barely conscious from hunger and exhaustion. Margaret had worked for 3 days straight, feeding the fire, forcing broth down parched throats, sharing her own body heat with the dying baby. She delivered that woman's final words to her daughter, helped bury her when the ground thawed, and saw Sarah and little James safely to relatives in Helena. She never saw them again after that winter, though she'd heard through the years that Sarah had married well, that her husband had become successful in cattle ranching. Margaret had been glad for that. Everyone deserved a chance at happiness, especially after surviving such heartbreak. Now, sitting in the back of her nephew's wagon like cargo to be sold, Margaret wondered if Sarah Blackwood even remembered the woman who'd saved her life. Probably not. People moved on, built new lives, left old debts unpaid, not from malice, but from the simple passage of time. The sun climbed higher, and the auction proceeded with brutal efficiency. Prime Angus cattle went for good prices, despite the drought. Farm equipment sold for less than expected, but sold nonetheless. Thomas grew more agitated as the morning progressed, checking his pocket watch obsessively and muttering calculations under his breath. Lot 47, the auctioneer finally called, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. Domestic arrangement. Mrs. Margaret Whitfield, age 72, experienced in cooking, cleaning, child-rearing and medical care. Seller indicates the subject is in good health, no significant ailments, quiet disposition. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, but now that it had arrived, the reality of it settled over them like a pall. Margaret rose slowly from the wagon bench, accepting Thomas's offered hand with cold dignity. She climbed the few steps to the auction block with her head held high, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. Standing there, elevated above the crowd, she could see the full scope of her humiliation. Men she'd known for decades avoided her gaze. Women she'd helped through difficult births whispered behind their hands. Children started with the frank curiosity of the young, not yet understanding why the adults around them seemed so uncomfortable. But Margaret also saw something else in that crowd, genuine anguish on many faces, helpless anger at a system that would allow such degradation, and here and there tears shed for a woman who had given so much to this community and now found herself with nowhere to turn. "Opening bid is $5, the auctioneer announced. Mrs. Whitfield comes with a good reputation for cooking and housekeeping. Medical knowledge, too. Birthed half the babies in this county, I'm told. Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. $5 was nothing, less than the cost of a decent meal in Helena, less than most men spent on whiskey in a week. But it represented something far more valuable, the last shred of Margaret's independence, her dignity, her right to determine her own fate. A hand finally rose in the back of the crowd, Ezra Patterson, who owned the general store. $5, he called reluctantly. Margaret knew he couldn't afford to keep her, but he was trying to drive up the price, to salvage what little dignity he could for an old friend. I hear 5, the auctioneer acknowledged. Do I hear 10? Another hand, this one belonging to Dr. Samuel Hayes. Margaret had worked alongside him during the influenza outbreak and had been his unofficial nurse for years when the town couldn't afford to pay one. $10. Thomas brightened slightly. $10 was still nowhere near enough to settle his debts, but it was better than 5. He needed at least 50 to satisfy his most pressing creditors, a sum that might as well have been 500. For all the likelihood of someone in Cedar Ridge having that kind of cash to spare on charity. $10, the auctioneer repeated. Surely we can do better than 10 for a woman of Mrs. Whitfield's experience and reputation. Do I hear 15? The silence returned, heavier now. $10 represented the limits of kindness in a town struggling to survive. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, accepting her fate. She would go to Dr. Hayes's household, probably sleep in the root cellar, work until her hands bled to justify the expense of keeping her fed. It wasn't the worst outcome she could imagine, but it was far from the life she'd hoped to live in her remaining years. Going once at $10, the auctioneer called. Going twice. That's when the voice cut across the square like a blade through silk, strong and clear, and carrying the unmistakable authority of real money. $100. The crowd turned as one, necks craning to see who had spoken. Margaret's eyes snapped open, her heart stopping for a moment before resuming at double speed. There at the edge of the square sat a man on a magnificent black stallion that gleamed like polished obsidian in the harsh sunlight. He was tall, even sitting down, with broad shoulders beneath a perfectly tailored black coat. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across his face, but Margaret could see the strong line of his jaw and the pale grey eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle, and everything about him spoke of wealth and power held in careful check. Did I hear correctly? The auctioneer stammered. $100. You heard correctly, the stranger replied, his voice carrying clearly. Across the stunned silence, he dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the packed earth without a sound. As he walked forward, the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, some recognizing him, others simply responding to the presence of someone far above their station. Margaret felt her knees grow weak. She knew that walk, had seen it years ago, in a much younger man who'd come to collect his wife and child from a sod house after the worst winter in memory. The eyes were the same. Though older now and marked by weather and responsibility, the jawline was familiar beneath its burden of years and success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James Blackwood, she whispered, the name carrying no further than her own ears. The little baby she'd helped save from freezing to death in the winter of 1900 had grown into one of the most powerful cattle barons in Montana Territory. The Blackwood Ranch stretched across 3 counties, employed hundreds of men, and shipped beef as far as Chicago and New York. James Blackwood was a name spoken with respect from Miles City to Great Falls, a man who could buy and sell half the Two towns in Montana without feeling the expense, and now he stood at the base of the auction block, looking up at the woman who had saved his life, his pale grey eyes unreadable as winter sky. $100 is the bid, the auctioneer announced, his voice shaking slightly. $100 was more money than most people in Cedar Ridge saw in 6 months. It was enough to buy prime breeding stock, a good horse, or a year's worth of supplies. Thomas nearly collapsed with relief. $100 would settle his debts and leave him with enough to start over somewhere else, far from the men who wanted to break his legs over unpaid gambling losses. He didn't care who was bidding or why. Salvation was salvation, whatever form it took. Any other bids? The auctioneer called, though his voice suggested he didn't expect any. Who in their right mind would bid against James Blackwood? And what sane person would pay more than $100 for domestic help, no matter how experienced? The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of Margaret's own breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. She studied James Blackwood's face, searching for some sign of recognition, some indication of why he was here. But his expression remained as unreadable as carved stone. "Going once at $100, the auctioneer called. "Going twice." Margaret found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't say whether she hoped someone would outbid him or not. James Blackwood was wealthy enough to treat her well, powerful enough to protect her from further humiliation. But he was also a stranger now, despite their shared history. The baby she'd helped save bore little resemblance to the hard-eyed man standing before the auction block. "Sold!" The auctioneer's hammer fell with finality. "Lot 47 to Mr. James Blackwood for $100. The crowd began to murmur and shift, the excitement of witnessing something unprecedented gradually giving way to the practical concerns of daily life. But Margaret barely heard them. She was lost in memory, transported back to a frigid winter night when she'd held a blue-faced baby against her chest and willed her own warmth into his tiny body. James Blackwood stepped forward and extended his hand to help her down from the auction block. His touch was gentle but firm, the calluses on his palm speaking of hard work despite his obvious wealth. As their eyes met for the first time in 23 years, Margaret saw something flicker in those pale grey depths. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. "Ma'am," he said simply, tipping his hat, "if you'll come with me, I'll see you settled properly." His voice was deeper now, roughened by years of shouting orders across vast ranges and negotiating with hard men in smoke-filled rooms. But underneath it all, Margaret could still hear the echo of the crying baby she'd once comforted through the longest night of winter. Thomas appeared at her elbow, practically vibrating with relief and avarice. "Mr. Blackwood, sir. It's an honor. My aunt, she's a good worker, won't give you any trouble. Here's her papers, such as they are, birth certificate, marriage licenses, medical history." James took the envelope without looking at it, his attention focused entirely on Margaret. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said formally, "are you ready to leave?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Everything she owned in the world was already packed in a single carpet bag sitting in Thomas's wagon. Her life had been reduced to what could fit in a space smaller than a hatbox. James gestured toward a wagon that hadn't been there minutes before. A fine vehicle with cushioned seats and a canvas top to keep off the sun. 2 of his men sat in the driver's seat, their faces respectfully neutral, but their eyes watchful. Everything about them spoke of competence and loyalty, the kind of men who would follow orders without question and never speak of what they witnessed. As Margaret walked toward the wagon, she felt the eyes of the entire town upon her. Some watched, with pity, others with curiosity, still others with the kind of prurient interest that fed on others' misfortune. But she kept her chin up and her pace steady, determined not to give them any more entertainment than they'd already extracted from her humiliation. James helped her into the wagon with the same careful courtesy he might have shown a lady of quality, arranging the cushions behind her back and ensuring her carpet bag was secured properly. His movements were efficient, but not hurried, and Margaret sensed that he was giving her time to compose herself before they departed. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly as he settled beside her. "Home," he replied simply. "We're going home." A wagon rolled out of Cedar Ridge without ceremony, leaving behind the dusty courthouse square and the whispers that would follow Margaret's name for years to come. As the town fell away behind them, she allowed herself one last look at the place where she'd spent most of her adult life, where she'd raised children and buried husbands and carved out a small space of dignity in an often harsh world. Then she turned her face forward, toward whatever waited ahead, and tried not to think about the fact that her fate now rested entirely in the hands of a baby she'd once saved from freezing to death in the worst winter anyone could remember. The Blackwood wagon rolled across the Montana prairie with the steady rhythm of well-maintained wheels and seasoned horses. Margaret sat in contemplative silence, watching the landscape transform from the dusty browns of drought-stricken farmland to the richer greens of properly irrigated ranch country. The difference was stark. Where Cedar Ridge struggled with failed crops and dying cattle, the Blackwood territory showed signs of careful management and abundant water rights. James rode alongside the wagon on his black stallion, occasionally dropping back to check on his passenger, but maintaining a respectful distance that spoke of careful consideration rather than indifference. Margaret found herself studying his profile when she thought he wasn't looking, searching for traces of the infant she'd once held. The strong jaw was there, the determined set of his shoulders, but everything else had been shaped by decades of responsibility and hard-won success. "Mrs. Whitfield," James finally spoke as they crested a hill that offered a sweeping view of the valley beyond. "I imagine you have questions." Margaret smoothed her skirts, choosing her words carefully. "I assume you remember that winter?" Every detail. His voice carried a gravity that suggested those memories weren't easily born. "I was told the story many times growing up, how a woman from Cedar Ridge fought through a blizzard to reach our soddy, how she saved my mother's life and mine, how she stayed for 3 days, sleeping on the floor, sharing her food, keeping the fire burning when everyone else had given us up for dead." The wagon wheels found a particularly rough patch of ground, and Margaret gripped the side rail to steady herself. "Your mother was a good woman, strong. She fought hard to stay alive for you." Catherine, the elder, bobbed a quick curtsy. "Pleased to meet you, Mom. Mr. Blackwood said you might need anything. We're to see you get it right away." "That's very kind," Margaret replied, touched by their obvious eagerness to please. "But I hope to pull my own weight around here." Susan, who couldn't have been more than 16, looked puzzled. "But, ma'am, you're Mr. Blackwood's guest. You don't need to work." Eleanor and Margaret exchanged a knowing look. "Mrs. Whitfield isn't the sort to sit idle," Eleanor explained gently. "She's going to be helping us keep the ranch hands healthy and whole." As if summoned by their conversation, the kitchen door burst open and a young man stumbled in, supporting another who was obviously in considerable pain. The injured man's left arm hung at an awkward angle, and his face was pale with shock. "Mrs. Caldwell," the first man called out, his voice tight with urgency. "Tommy fell from the barn loft. Think his arms broke badly." Margaret's training kicked in instantly. She was moving before her conscious mind had fully processed the situation, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Bring him over here," she instructed, clearing space at the long table. "Lay him down gently." Tommy was perhaps 20, with the lean build of a man who worked with his hands for a living. His brown hair was matted with sweat, and his breathing came in short, sharp gasps that spoke of significant pain. Margaret's experienced eyes immediately assessed the injury. A clean break of the radius from the look of it, but no bone protruding through the skin. "What's your name, son?" she asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Tommy Hutchins, ma'am," he managed through gritted teeth. "Lord, it hurts something fierce." "I know it does," Margaret soothed, her voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone she'd perfected over decades of dealing with medical emergencies. "But you're going to be fine. This is a clean break, and clean breaks heal well if they're set properly." Eleanor appeared at her elbow with a wooden medical kit that looked well stocked and frequently used. "Will this help?" she asked. Margaret opened the kit and nodded approvingly at its contents. Laudanum for pain, clean bandages, splinting materials, even a small bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning wounds. "This is excellent. Maria, could I trouble you for some hot water? And Catherine, I'll need some clean clothes, as many as you can find." The kitchen transformed into an impromptu medical clinic as the household staff sprang into action with practiced efficiency. Margaret realized this wasn't the first time they'd dealt with ranch injuries, though perhaps not usually with such expert care available. "Tommy," Margaret said, preparing a dose of laudanum, "this will help with the pain, but you'll need to stay awake while I set the bone." "Can you do that for me?" The young man nodded bravely, though sweat beaded on his forehead. Margaret administered the medicine and waited for it to take effect, using the time to gather her supplies and plan her approach. Setting bones was delicate work, too gentle and the break wouldn't align properly, too rough and she could cause additional damage. "Tell me about the fall," she said, both to distract Tommy and to better understand his injuries. "How exactly did it happen?" "Was stacking hay in the loft," Tommy explained, his words already beginning to slur slightly as the laudanum took hold. "Board gave way under my feet. Tried to catch myself on the way down, but landed wrong on my arm." Margaret nodded, having seen similar injuries countless times. Ranch work was inherently dangerous, and accidents were an unfortunate but inevitable part of life. What mattered was how quickly and effectively they were treated. "All right, Tommy," she said, positioning herself at his side. "This is going to hurt, but only for a moment. Susan, I need you to hold his shoulders steady. Catherine, support his elbow." With swift, sure movements born of long experience, Margaret manipulated the broken bone back into proper alignment. Tommy cried out once. A sharp sound of pain quickly stifled, but the bone slipped back into place with an almost audible click. "There," Margaret breathed, wiping perspiration from her forehead. "The worst is over. Now we just need to splint it properly and let nature do her work." As she wrapped the arm with practiced efficiency, padding the splint and securing it with clean bandages, Margaret became aware that the kitchen had grown unusually quiet. She looked up to find everyone watching her with expressions of awe and respect. "That was remarkable," Eleanor said softly. "I've seen the doctor in Billings set bones, and he wasn't half so gentle or quick about it." "Experience teaches efficiency," Margaret replied modestly, though she couldn't help feeling a flush of pride at their obvious admiration. It had been too long since her skills were truly needed, since she felt the satisfaction of healing work. "Well done." The kitchen door opened again and James entered, clearly having been summoned by news of the accident. His pale eyes took in the scene immediately. Tommy resting comfortably on the improvised examination table, his arm properly splintered, and Margaret cleaning her hands in a basin of warm water. "How is he?" James asked, approaching the table, with obvious concern for his employee. "Clean break of the radius," Margaret reported professionally. "Properly set and splinted. He'll need to keep the arm immobilized for 6 weeks, but he should heal completely with no lasting complications." James's expression relaxed visibly. "And the pain?" "Laudanum for now, willow bark tea once that wears off." "The worst will pass in a day or two?" Margaret dried her hands and looked up at him. "He's a brave young man, took the setting without complaint." "Tommy's good people," James agreed, placing a gentle hand on the injured man's good shoulder. "Take All the time you need to heal, son. Your job will be waiting when you're ready. The simple kindness in his words spoke volumes about the kind of employer James had become. Margaret had seen too many bosses who viewed injured workers as disposable inconveniences, easily replaced and quickly forgotten. This consideration for a ranch hand's welfare revealed a character shaped by his own early struggles. "Can you walk, Tommy?" Margaret asked. "Or would you prefer to rest here a while longer?" "I can walk, ma'am," Tommy said, struggling to sit up with help from his friend. "Feel a lot better already, thanks to you." "Take it easy for the rest of the day," Margaret instructed. "No heavy lifting, no climbing, no activities that might jar the brake. And come see me tomorrow so I can check how it's healing." After Tommy was helped back to the bunkhouse, the kitchen gradually returned to its normal rhythm. But Margaret noticed a difference in how the staff interacted with her. There was a new respect in their voices, a deference that had nothing to do with her position as James's guest and everything to do with the competence she'd just demonstrated. "Mrs. Whitfield," James said, lingering as the others dispersed to their daily duties. "That was impressive work. Tommy's lucky you were here." "Lucky I had a well-stocked medical kit and a clean place to work," Margaret replied pragmatically. "Most ranch injuries I've dealt with were in barns or bunkhouses, with whatever supplies were at hand. Eleanor keeps that kit well maintained. We've had our share of accidents over the years." James paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Would you be willing to take on medical duties for the ranch permanently? I'd pay you properly, of course, not as a guest, but as a valued employee." The offer touched Margaret more deeply than he probably realized. To be valued for her skills, to have her experience recognized as worth compensation, it was a dignity she'd feared was lost forever. "I'd be honored," she said simply. "Though I should warn you, I have no formal credentials. Everything I know was learned through necessity and practice. The men don't care about certificates from medical schools," James replied with a slight smile. "They care about results, and from what I just saw, you get excellent results." Eleanor approached them, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. "Mrs. Whitfield, you must be hungry after all that excitement. Maria made these this morning. They're still warm." Margaret accepted the offered refreshments gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since yesterday evening. The biscuits were light as air and golden brown, clearly made by someone who understood the alchemy of flour, butter, and skill. "These are wonderful," she said after taking a bite. "Better than anything I ever managed." Maria learned from her grandmother in Mexico, Eleanor explained. "She has magic in her hands when it comes to baking." "Speaking of hands," James interjected, "I should warn you that ranch work provides plenty of opportunities for medical practice. Between accidents, seasonal illnesses, and the general wear and tear of hard living, you'll likely find yourself busier than you expect." "I welcome the challenge," Margaret replied honestly. "I've spent too many years watching my skills rust from disuse. It feels good to be needed again." The morning passed quickly as Eleanor showed Margaret around the ranch compound, introducing her to the various outbuildings and explaining the daily rhythms of ranch life. The scale of the operation was impressive. Besides the cattle operation, Blackwood Ranch maintained extensive vegetable gardens, a dairy operation, and even a small orchard that provided fresh fruit for the household. "Mr. Blackwood believes in self-sufficiency wherever possible," Eleanor explained as they toured the root cellar, which was stocked with preserved vegetables and cured meats. "The more we can produce ourselves, the less we depend on supply wagons from town." Margaret nodded approvingly. She'd lived through enough lean times to appreciate the wisdom of preparation and self-reliance. Sensible approach. Store-bought goods can be unreliable, especially in winter. Exactly. And with 60 men to feed year-round, plus additional, and during roundup season, Food security is a significant concern. They were interrupted by the arrival of a rider, a young man who dismounted near the main house and approached them with obvious urgency. Margaret recognized him as one of the ranch hands she'd seen working cattle the day before. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called out, slightly out of breath. "Sorry to bother you, but we've got a situation down at the south pasture. One of the new hands took a sudden like, and Frank thinks it might be serious." Eleanor turned to Margaret. "Would you be willing to take a look? We could saddle a horse, or take the wagon if you prefer." Margaret felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with being needed in a crisis. "The wagon, I think. I'll want to bring supplies, and we might need to transport the patient back here." Within minutes, they were loaded into a light wagon with the medical kit and additional supplies Eleanor had gathered. Margaret found herself appreciating the efficiency with which the ranch operated. Everyone knew their role and performed it without unnecessary discussion or delay. The ride to the south pasture took them through some of the most beautiful country Margaret had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in rich grass stretched to distant mountains, while streams threaded through stands of cottonwood and aspen. Cattle dotted the landscape like scattered brown pearls, fat and content in their prosperity. "How long has Mr. Blackwood owned all this land?" Margaret asked, as they bounced along the well-maintained road. "He's been acquiring parcels for 15 years, Eleanor replied. "Started with a few hundred acres and just kept expanding as opportunities arose. Always pays fair prices, never force anyone to sell. That's earned him a good reputation with his neighbors." Margaret filed that information away, adding it to her growing understanding of the man James had become. Wealth could corrupt as easily as it could elevate, but he seemed to have maintained both his integrity and his compassion despite his success. They found the sick ranch hand lying in the shade of a large oak tree, surrounded by concerned co-workers. Frank Morrison, the ranch foreman and father of the 2 housemaids, looked relieved to see them arrive. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "This here's Billy Crawford, just hired last week. Been complaining of stomach and pains since yesterday, but this morning it got real bad, real fast." Margaret knelt beside the young man, who was curled on his side and clearly in significant distress. His face was flushed with fever, and she could see the telltale signs of severe abdominal pain in his posture and shallow breathing. "Billy," she said gently, placing a cool hand on his forehead. "I'm Mrs. Whitfield. Can you tell me where it hurts?" "Right. Here, ma'am," Billy gasped, pointing to his lower right abdomen. "Started as a dull ache yesterday, but now it's like someone stabbing me with a hot poker." Margaret's experienced hands gently probed his abdomen, noting the rigid muscles and the way he flinched when she applied even light pressure to the affected area. Combined with the fever and the specific location of the pain, the diagnosis was clear and potentially serious. "Frank," she said, rising and drawing him aside, "we need to get him to a proper doctor immediately. This looks like appendicitis. And if that appendix ruptures," Frank's weathered face paled. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. But the sooner he gets proper surgical care, the better his chances." Margaret turned back to the wagon, already planning their next moves. "We'll take him directly to Billings. Eleanor, can you send word ahead to the doctor there?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, already signaling to one of the riders. "Peterson, ride hard to town and tell Dr. Mitchell we're bringing in a surgical emergency. Tell him it's appendicitis and to prepare accordingly." As they carefully loaded Billy into the wagon, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns life could take. Yesterday, she'd been sold like livestock. Today, she was potentially saving a life. Purpose, it seemed, had a way of finding those who were ready to embrace it. The race to Billings would test both her medical skills and her newfound place in this carefully ordered world. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive, truly useful, truly home. The wagon wheels thundered against the hard-packed road to Billings, each jolt sending waves of pain through Billy Crawford's fevered body. Margaret sat beside him in the wagon bed, one steady hand on his shoulder, the other monitoring his pulse as the miles flew by beneath them. Eleanor handled the reins with the skill of someone accustomed to ranch emergencies, pushing the horses hard but not recklessly. "How much farther?" Margaret called over the noise of wheels and hoofbeats. 5 miles, maybe 6, Eleanor replied, her voice tight with concentration. "Dr. Mitchell should be ready for us. Peterson's a fast rider." Billy's condition had worsened. During the journey, his fever spiked higher, and the rigid tension in his abdomen suggested the inflammation was progressing rapidly. Margaret had seen appendicitis before, knew the deadly timeline they were racing against. If the appendix ruptured, before they reached surgical care, infection would spread through Billy's body faster than any medicine could stop it. "Stay with me, Billy," Margaret murmured, applying a cool, damp cloth to his forehead. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." The young ranch hand's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever but still conscious. "Am I gonna die, ma'am?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wagon's racket. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Margaret replied firmly. "You're strong, you're young, and we're getting you the best care available. Focus on breathing, try to stay calm." As they crested a hill, the town of Billings spread out before them, a bustling settlement that had grown prosperous on cattle and railroad money. Margaret could see the doctor's office, a neat white building with a red cross painted on its door, and her heart lifted when she spotted a familiar figure waiting on the front porch. Dr. Mitchell was a tall, spare man in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady hands that inspired confidence in desperate situations. He'd been practicing medicine on the frontier for over 20 years, and Margaret had heard nothing but good things about his skill and dedication. "Bring him straight in," Dr. Mitchell called, as their wagon pulled up to his office. "I've got the surgery prepared and my assistant standing by." The next few minutes passed in a blur of organized urgency. Billy was transferred to a proper examination table, his condition quickly assessed by the doctor, and preparations made for immediate surgery. Margaret found herself assisting with practiced efficiency, anticipating needs and providing information about the patient's symptoms and condition. "Excellent preliminary care," Dr. Mitchell murmured as he examined Billy's abdomen. "You've kept him stable and comfortable during what must have been a difficult journey. Are you a trained nurse?" "Self-taught," Margaret replied, helping to position Billy for surgery. 40 years of frontier medicine, mostly births and emergencies." "Well, you've got good instincts," the doctor said, beginning his preparations. "This is definitely appendicitis, and we caught it just in time. Another few hours, and we'd be dealing with a much more serious situation." Eleanor waited in the outer office while Margaret assisted with the surgery, her years of experience making her invaluable in the cramped conditions of a frontier medical practice. Dr. Mitchell worked with swift, sure movements, his scalpel finding the infected appendix and removing it before the deadly rupture could occur. "There," he said finally, beginning to close the incision. "Crisis averted. Young Billy should make a full recovery, assuming we keep the wound clean and watch for signs of infection." Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction of medical work well done, the profound relief that came with snatching someone back from death's doorway. It was a feeling she'd missed more than she'd realized during her years of declining usefulness. "He'll need to stay here for observation," Dr. Mitchell continued. "At least a week, possibly 2. Abdominal surgery is serious business, and infection is always a risk. Mr. Blackwood will want to cover all expenses," Eleanor interjected from the doorway. "And if Billy needs anything, special food, additional care, whatever helps his recovery, please don't hesitate to arrange it." Dr. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "James Blackwood? I heard he'd bought someone at the Cedar Ridge auction, but I didn't realize..." He turned to Margaret with new interest. "You're the woman everyone's talking about." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I suppose news travels fast in small communities." "Especially news like that," the doctor replied with a slight smile. "Though from what I've seen today, Mr. Blackwood made an excellent investment. Your skills are impressive, Mrs. Whitfield." Margaret Whitfield. "Mr. Blackwood believes in self-sufficiency wherever possible," Eleanor explained as they toured the root cellar, which was stocked with preserved vegetables and cured meats. "The more we can produce ourselves, the less we depend on supply wagons from town." Margaret nodded approvingly. She'd lived through enough lean times to appreciate the wisdom of preparation and self-reliance. Sensible approach. Store-bought goods can be unreliable, especially in winter. Exactly. And with 60 men to feed year-round, plus additional. And during roundup season, food security is a significant concern. They were interrupted by the arrival of a rider, a young man who dismounted near the main house and approached them with obvious urgency. Margaret recognized him as one of the ranch hands she'd seen working cattle the day before. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called out, slightly out of breath. "Sorry to bother you, but we've got a situation down at the south pasture. One of the new hands took a sudden like, and Frank thinks it might be serious." Eleanor turned to Margaret. "Would you be willing to take a look? We could saddle a horse, or take the wagon if you prefer." Margaret felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with being needed in a crisis. "The wagon, I think. I'll want to bring supplies, and we might need to transport the patient back here." Within minutes, they were loaded into a light wagon with the medical kit and additional supplies Eleanor had gathered. Margaret found herself appreciating the efficiency with which the ranch operated. Everyone knew their role and performed it without unnecessary discussion or delay. The ride to the south pasture took them through some of the most beautiful country Margaret had ever seen. Rolling hills covered in rich grass stretched to distant mountains, while streams threaded through stands of cottonwood and aspen. Cattle dotted the landscape like scattered brown pearls, fat and content in their prosperity. "How long has Mr. Blackwood owned all this land?" Margaret asked, as they bounced along the well-maintained road. "He's been acquiring parcels for 15 years, Eleanor replied. "Started with a few hundred acres and just kept expanding as opportunities arose. Always pays fair prices, never force anyone to sell. That's earned him a good reputation with his neighbors." Margaret filed that information away, adding it to her growing understanding of the man James had become. Wealth could corrupt as easily as it could elevate, but he seemed to have maintained both his integrity and his compassion despite his success. They found the sick ranch hand lying in the shade of a large oak tree, surrounded by concerned co-workers. Frank Morrison, the ranch foreman and father of the 2 housemaids, looked relieved to see them arrive. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "This here's Billy Crawford, just hired last week. Been complaining of stomach and pains since yesterday, but this morning it got real bad, real fast." Margaret knelt beside the young man, who was curled on his side and clearly in significant distress. His face was flushed with fever, and she could see the telltale signs of severe abdominal pain in his posture and shallow breathing. "Billy," she said gently, placing a cool hand on his forehead. "I'm Mrs. Whitfield. Can you tell me where it hurts?" "Right. Here, ma'am," Billy gasped, pointing to his lower right abdomen. "Started as a dull ache yesterday, but now it's like someone stabbing me with a hot poker." Margaret's experienced hands gently probed his abdomen, noting the rigid muscles and the way he flinched when she applied even light pressure to the affected area. Combined with the fever and the specific location of the pain, the diagnosis was clear and potentially serious. "Frank," she said, rising and drawing him aside. "We need to get him to a proper doctor immediately. This looks like appendicitis. And if that appendix ruptures," Frank's weathered face paled. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. but the sooner he gets proper surgical care, the better his chances. Margaret turned back to the wagon, already planning their next moves. We'll take him directly to Billings. Eleanor, can you send word ahead to the doctor there? Of course, Eleanor replied, already signaling to one of the riders. Peterson, ride hard to town and tell Dr. Mitchell we're bringing in a surgical emergency. Tell him it's appendicitis and to prepare accordingly. As they carefully loaded Billy into the wagon, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns life could take. Yesterday, she'd been sold like livestock. Today, she was potentially saving a life. Purpose, it seemed, had a way of finding those who were ready to embrace it. The race to Billings would test both her medical skills and her newfound place in this carefully ordered world. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive, truly useful, truly home. The wagon wheels thundered against the hard-packed road to Billings, each jolt sending waves of pain through Billy Crawford's fevered body. Margaret sat beside him in the wagon bed, one steady hand on his shoulder, the other monitoring his pulse as the miles flew by beneath them. Eleanor handled the reins with the skill of someone accustomed to ranch emergencies, pushing the horses hard but not recklessly. "How much farther?" Margaret called over the noise of wheels and hoofbeats. 5 miles, maybe 6, Eleanor replied, her voice tight with concentration. Dr. Mitchell should be ready for us. Peterson's a fast rider. Billy's condition had worsened. During the journey, his fever spiked higher, and the rigid tension in his abdomen suggested the inflammation was progressing rapidly. Margaret had seen appendicitis before, knew the deadly timeline they were racing against. If the appendix ruptured, before they reached surgical care, infection would spread through Billy's body faster than any medicine could stop it. "Stay with me, Billy," Margaret murmured, applying a cool, damp cloth to his forehead. "We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." The young ranch hand's eyes fluttered open, glazed with fever but still conscious. "Am I gonna die, ma'am?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wagon's racket. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Margaret replied firmly. "You're strong, you're young, and we're getting you the best care available. Focus on breathing, try to stay calm." As they crested a hill, the town of Billings spread out before them, a bustling settlement that had grown prosperous on cattle and railroad money. Margaret could see the doctor's office, a neat white building with a red cross painted on its door, and her heart lifted when she spotted a familiar figure waiting on the front porch. Dr. Mitchell was a tall, spare man in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady hands that inspired confidence in desperate situations. He'd been practicing medicine on the frontier for over 20 years, and Margaret had heard nothing but good things about his skill and dedication. "Bring him straight in," Dr. Mitchell called as their wagon pulled up to his office. "I've got the surgery prepared and my assistant standing by." The next few minutes passed in a blur of organized urgency. Billy was transferred to a proper examination table, his condition quickly assessed by the doctor and preparations made for immediate surgery. Margaret found herself assisting with practiced efficiency, anticipating needs and providing information about the patient's symptoms and condition. "Excellent preliminary care," Dr. Mitchell murmured as he examined Billy's abdomen. "You've kept him stable and comfortable during what must have been a difficult journey. Are you a trained nurse?" "Self-taught," Margaret replied, helping to position Billy for surgery. 40 years of frontier medicine, mostly births and emergencies." "Well, you've got good instincts," the doctor said, beginning his preparations. "This is definitely appendicitis, and we caught it just in time. Another few hours, and we'd be dealing with a much more serious situation." Eleanor waited in the outer office while Margaret assisted with the surgery, her years of experience making her invaluable in the cramped conditions of a frontier medical practice. Dr. Mitchell worked with swift, sure movements, his scalpel finding the infected appendix and removing it before the deadly rupture could occur. "There," he said finally, beginning to close the incision. Crisis averted. Young Billy should make a full recovery, assuming we keep the wound clean and watch for signs of infection. Margaret felt the familiar satisfaction of medical work well done, the profound relief that came with snatching someone back from death's doorway. It was a feeling she'd missed more than she'd realized during her years of declining usefulness. "He'll need to stay here for observation," Dr. Mitchell continued. "At least a week, possibly 2. Abdominal surgery is serious business, and infection is always a risk. Mr. Blackwood will want to cover all expenses," Eleanor interjected from the doorway. "And if Billy needs anything, special food, additional care, whatever helps his recovery, please don't hesitate to arrange it." Dr. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "James Blackwood? I heard he'd bought someone at the Cedar Ridge auction, but I didn't realize—" He turned to Margaret with new interest. "You're the woman everyone's talking about." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I suppose news travels fast in small communities." "Especially news like that," the doctor replied with a slight smile. "Though from what I've seen today, Mr. Blackwood made an excellent investment. Your skills are impressive, Mrs. Whitfield. Margaret Whitfield. Well, Mrs. Whitfield, if you ever decide you'd like more formal medical training, I'd be happy to discuss arrangements. Frontier doctors can always use skilled assistance." The offer was tempting, but Margaret found herself shaking her head. "Thank you, but I believe I've found where I belong. The Blackwood Ranch keeps me plenty busy." As they prepared to leave Billy in Dr. Mitchell's capable hands, Margaret felt a strange mixture of accomplishment and unease. The successful treatment of his appendicitis had cemented her position as the ranch's medical provider, but it had also made her more visible to the wider community. Word of her presence at Blackwood Ranch would spread, and with it, questions about her past and her relationship to James. The journey back to the ranch passed more quietly, with Eleanor maintaining a steady pace that allowed for conversation. "You probably saved that boy's life today," she said, as they rolled through the gathering dusk. "Dr. Mitchell saved his life," Margaret corrected. "I just helped keep him stable until proper care was available." "Don't minimize your contribution," Eleanor replied firmly. "Without your quick diagnosis and care during the journey, Billy might not have survived the trip to town. The men will remember Mrs. Whitfield. Word of what you did today will spread through every bunkhouse and saloon from here to Helena." That prospect made Margaret slightly uncomfortable. She'd spent most of her life working quietly in the background, helping when needed, but never seeking recognition or attention. The idea of becoming a subject of conversation among ranch hands and townspeople was unsettling. "Is that a problem?" she asked carefully. Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. "It could be. There are people who resent Mr. Blackwood's success, who'd love to find something to criticize about his operations. Buying a woman at auction, no matter how noble his intentions, gives them ammunition. And my presence here makes it worse?" "Your competence makes it better," Eleanor replied diplomatically. "It's harder to criticize James for extravagance when his purchase is clearly earning her keep through valuable skills. But there will always be those who look for scandals, especially involving wealthy men and women of uncertain status." Margaret understood the delicate social dynamics at play. Her position at the ranch was unusual, potentially controversial, and subject to misinterpretation by those inclined toward gossip or malice. She would need to be careful not to provide ammunition for James's enemies. They arrived at the ranch. As full darkness settled over the Montana landscape, the house windows glowing warm and welcoming against the star-studded sky. James met them at the front door, his face tight with concern. "How is Billy?" he asked immediately. "Surgery went well," Margaret reported. "Dr. Mitchell removed the appendix before it could rupture. Billy should make a full recovery, though he'll need to stay in town for observation." Relief flooded James's features. "Thank God. And thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. Eleanor told me you diagnosed the condition immediately, probably saved his life." "I did what needed doing," Margaret replied simply. "Any experienced person would have recognized the symptoms." "Perhaps, but not everyone would have acted so quickly and decisively." James gestured toward the house. "Come inside. Dinner's waiting, and I imagine you're both exhausted." The evening meal was a quiet affair, with Margaret, James, and Eleanor sharing a simple but elegant dinner in the ranch house's formal dining room. The conversation focused on practical matters: arrangements for Billy's care, adjustments to work schedules to account for his absence, and plans for handling future medical emergencies. "I've been thinking," James said as Maria served dessert, a delicate custard flavored with vanilla and topped with fresh berries. "We should establish a proper medical facility here on the ranch. Nothing elaborate, but a clean, well-equipped space where you can treat injuries and illnesses without improvising in the kitchen." Margaret looked up, surprised by the suggestion. "That's very generous, but probably unnecessary. Most ranch injuries can be handled anywhere with good light and clean water. Maybe, but you deserve better facilities for your work. And if word spreads about the quality of medical care available here, we might find ourselves treating people from neighboring ranches as well. Could be a valuable service to the community." The idea had merit, Margaret admitted. Proper medical facilities were scarce in ranch country, and a well-equipped clinic could indeed serve the broader region. It would also give her work a more professional standing, reducing the perception that she was merely a household dependent. "Where would you put such a facility?" Eleanor asked, clearly intrigued by the concept. "The old foreman's office," James replied promptly. "It's well built, has good light and ventilation, and it's close enough to the house for convenience, but separate enough to maintain patient privacy." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. A real medical clinic, properly equipped and maintained, where she could practice her skills with dignity and efficiency. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for. "If you're serious about this," she said carefully, "I'd be honored to help design the facility. I have some experience with what works and what doesn't in frontier medical practice." "Excellent," James said, his smile genuine and warm. "We'll start planning tomorrow. Eleanor can help with the practical arrangements, and we'll order proper medical supplies from Chicago or Denver." After dinner, Margaret found herself alone in her room with a collection of medical texts James had retrieved from his personal library. Apparently, his mother had maintained an interest in medical matters throughout her life, accumulating books on anatomy, surgery, and pharmacology that would serve as valuable references for Margaret's work. She was deep in a treatise on wound care when a soft knock came at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Eleanor with some household matter. Instead, James entered, carrying a brandy snifter and wearing an expression of unusual solemnity. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "But there's something we need to discuss." Margaret set aside her book and gestured toward the chair by the fireplace. "Of course. What's troubling you?" James settled into the chair and took a sip of his brandy before speaking. "Word of today's events will spread quickly. By tomorrow, half the territory will know that James Blackwood bought a woman at auction and that she's now providing medical care on his ranch." "Eleanor mentioned something similar," Margaret said carefully. "Are you concerned about the perception?" "I'm concerned about your safety," James replied bluntly. "There are people who resent my success, who'd love nothing more than to find a way to damage my reputation or hurt those I care about. Your presence here, your obvious competence and value to the operation, it makes you a potential target." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What kind of target? Gossip at minimum, accusations of impropriety, suggestions that our relationship is something other than what it is, but potentially worse. "There are," Men who've lost money or land or pride because of my business dealings. Men who might see you as a way to strike back at me. The implications of his words settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. She'd been so focused on finding her place in this new life that she hadn't considered the dangers her presence might create. "Perhaps I should leave," she said quietly. "Go somewhere else, find another position. I don't want to cause problems for you." "Absolutely not," James said firmly. "You belong here, Mrs. Whitfield. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. But I need you to understand the situation, to be aware of potential risks. What kind of precautions should I take? For now, just be cautious when you're away from the ranch. Don't travel alone, especially to town. Let Frank or one of the other men escort you when you need to go places. And if anyone approaches you with questions about your relationship to me or your role here, refer them to Eleanor or myself." Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom of his advice even as she chafed slightly at the restrictions. She'd lived independently for so long that accepting protection felt almost like admitting weakness. "There's something else," James continued, his voice dropping lower. "I've received word that Thomas Whitfield has been asking questions around Cedar Ridge, wanting to know how you're settling in here, whether you're happy, if you might be persuaded to renegotiate your situation." Margaret's blood turned cold. "Thomas? But he sold me. He took his money and settled his debts. What more could he want?" Perhaps he's realized he made a mistake. Perhaps his creditors are pressuring him again, and he thinks he can somehow claim you back and sell you to someone else for more money. Or perhaps he's working for someone else now, someone who has reasons to want information about my household. The thought of Thomas Whitfield trying to reclaim her filled Margaret with a terror that surprised her with its intensity. She'd found peace here, purpose, a kind of family she'd never expected to have again. The idea of being dragged back into her nephew's sordid schemes was unbearable. "Can he do that legally?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. "No," James said firmly. "The transaction was legal and binding. You belong here now, and no one can take you away without your consent. But Thomas might not understand the legal niceties, or he might be desperate enough to try something foolish." Margaret reached for James's hand without thinking, needing the reassurance of human contact. "I don't want to go back to that life," she whispered. "I'd rather die than go back to being Thomas's burden, his property to be sold when convenient." James's hand closed over hers, warm and strong and infinitely comforting. "That will never happen," he said with quiet intensity. "I give you my word, Mrs. Whitfield. No one will take you from here against your will. This is your home, and I'll protect it and you with everything I have." The promise in his voice was absolute, backed by the kind of wealth and power that could make such guarantees meaningful. But Margaret also heard something else, a personal investment that went beyond gratitude or obligation. Somehow, in the space of just a few days, she'd become important to him as more than just a link to his past. "Thank you," she said simply, squeezing his hand before releasing it. "I've been alone for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about my welfare." "You're not alone anymore," James replied, rising from his chair. "And you never will be again, not as long as I draw breath. Sleep well, Mrs. Whitfield. Tomorrow we'll start building that medical clinic, and the day after that we'll keep making this place the kind of home my mother would have been proud of." After he left, Margaret sat by the window looking out at the vast expanse of Blackwood Ranch, the distant mountains silhouetted against a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, Thomas Whitfield was scheming and plotting, probably encouraged by men with their own grievances against James. But here, in this beautiful room, in this magnificent house, she was safe and valued and home. The baby she'd saved had grown into a man of honor and power, someone who understood the importance of protecting those who'd protected him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Margaret faced them with the confidence that came from knowing she was no longer alone in the world. The past might cast shadows, but the future stretched bright and full of possibility. 3 weeks after Billy Crawford's surgery, the Blackwood Ranch Medical Clinic stood complete, a testament to both James's resources and his commitment to Margaret's work. The former foreman's office had been transformed into a proper medical facility, complete with an examination table, surgical instruments, a comprehensive pharmacy, and even a small recovery room for patients who needed overnight observation. Margaret stood in the doorway of her new domain, still marveling at the transformation. Sunlight streamed through enlarged windows, illuminating white-painted walls lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing medicines and supplies that would have been the envy of any city doctor. A brass nameplate beside the door read, M. Whitfield, Medical Practitioner, a title that filled her with quiet pride every time she saw it. "The supply wagon from Denver arrived this morning," Eleanor announced, entering with a manifest in her hands. Carbolic acid, laudanum, quinine, surgical thread, bandages, everything you requested and more. James was quite specific about getting the finest quality available. Margaret shook her head in amazement. The value of the medical supplies alone probably exceeded what most people earned in several years. "He's been incredibly generous. I hope I can justify this investment." "You already have," Eleanor replied firmly. "Word has spread about Billy's successful treatment, and we've had inquiries from 3 neighboring ranches about medical services. The Hendersons want you to examine their foreman's persistent cough. The McLeods have a ranch hand with a suspicious growth on his neck, and old Walt Brennan from the Triple Bar wants someone to look at his arthritis." The prospect of treating patients from beyond the Blackwood Ranch excited Margaret. It would establish her as a legitimate medical practitioner in the region, someone whose skills were valued by the community rather than merely tolerated as James's peculiar charity case. "When would they like me to see them?" Margaret asked, already mentally reviewing her supplies and planning treatment approaches. "The Hendersons are bringing their foreman this afternoon. The others will follow later in the week." Eleanor paused, her expression growing more serious. "There is one complication, though. Sheriff Morrison rode over from Cedar Ridge this morning. He wants to speak with you privately." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "About what?" "He wouldn't say specifically, but he mentioned there have been some irregularities regarding your nephew Thomas. Apparently, he's been making claims about the auction that don't match the official records." The spectre of Thomas Whitfield had haunted Margaret's thoughts for weeks, despite the security and purpose she'd found at the ranch. She'd hoped distance and time would discourage whatever schemes he might be hatching, but apparently her nephew was more persistent than she'd given him credit for. "Where is Sheriff Morrison now?" "In the parlor with James. They've been talking for about 20 minutes. Margaret smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the small mirror James had installed near the clinic's wash basin. Whatever Thomas was up to, she would face it with the dignity and strength that had carried her through 7 decades of life's challenges. She found Sheriff Morrison and James in the ranch house parlor, their conversation clearly serious. Morrison was a lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that inspired confidence in law enforcement. He rose respectfully when Margaret entered. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, touching his hat brim, "thank you for seeing me. I apologize for the intrusion, but there are some matters we need to discuss." "Of course, Sheriff. How can I help you?" Morrison pulled out a small notebook and consulted it briefly. "I've been investigating some claims made by your nephew Thomas Whitfield regarding the circumstances of your transaction at the Cedar Ridge auction." Margaret seated herself carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "What sort of claims?" "He's alleging that the auction was conducted improperly. that he didn't have the legal authority to sell your services, and that the transaction should be declared void. Morrison's discomfort with the entire situation was evident in his choice of words. James leaned forward in his chair. On what grounds could he possibly make such claims? The auction was properly conducted with witnesses and official records. Thomas claims he was acting under duress, that gambling debts and threats from creditors forced him into making decisions he wouldn't have made under normal circumstances. He's also suggesting that Mrs. Whitfield was coerced into compliance, that she didn't freely consent to the arrangement. Margaret felt anger rise in her chest like bile. That's absurd. Thomas had months to find alternative solutions to his financial problems. He chose to sell me because it was the easiest option for him, not because he had no choice. And your consent to the arrangement? Morrison asked gently. I had no choice in the matter, Margaret replied honestly. But that was Thomas's doing, not Mr. Blackwood's. James brought me to save me from a worse fate, and he's treated me with nothing but kindness and respect since then. Morrison made notes in his book, clearly trying to document the situation thoroughly. Thomas is also claiming that Mr. Blackwood has taken advantage of your vulnerable position to secure unpaid labor and services that would normally command significant compensation. James's jaw tightened dangerously. That's a lie. Mrs. Whitfield is compensated fairly for her medical work. She has complete freedom of movement and association, and she's treated as an honored member of this household, not as an employee or dependent. The medical work was her idea, Eleanor interjected from the doorway, where she'd been listening to the conversation. She insisted on earning her keep, rather than accepting charity. Mr. Blackwood provides her with excellent facilities and compensation. Sheriff Morrison looked around the elegant parlor, taking in the obvious comfort and quality of Margaret's surroundings. Mrs. Whitfield, do you feel that you're being held here against your will in any way? Absolutely not, Margaret replied, firmly. This is the first real home I've had since my husband died. I'm valued here, needed, respected. Thomas wants to void the transaction because he's realized he sold me too cheaply, not because he's concerned about my welfare. That brings up another point, Morrison said uncomfortably. Thomas claims that Mr. Blackwood deliberately bid an excessive amount to manipulate the auction results, that the $100 bid was so far above market value that it constituted manipulation of the process. James laughed bitterly. Market value. We're talking about a human being, Sheriff, not livestock. The only thing manipulative about that auction was Thomas's decision to put his aunt on the block in the first place. Morrison nodded sympathetically. I understand your position, Mr. Blackwood, and frankly, I agree with it. But I'm required to investigate these allegations thoroughly. The territorial government has been receiving pressure from certain reform groups about the practice of auctioning domestic arrangements. There's talk of new legislation that would restrict or eliminate such transactions. Margaret felt a chill of apprehension. If the territorial government decided to retroactively invalidate such auctions, her legal status here could become precarious. She might find herself forced to leave the only real home she'd known in years. What would that mean for Mrs. Whitfield's situation? James asked, voicing her unspoken fears. Hard to say. Existing arrangements might be grandfathered in, or they might be subject to review and renegotiation. A lot would depend on the specific language of any new laws. Morrison consulted his notes again. For now, I need to file a report about Mrs. Whitfield's current circumstances and her satisfaction with the arrangement. Your statements today will be part of that record. And Thomas? Margaret asked. What happens to his claims? Without evidence of actual wrongdoing or coercion, there's not much legal basis for voiding the transaction. But he could potentially file a civil suit claiming fraud or undue influence. That would be expensive and time-consuming, but possible. Margaret realized that Thomas was probably hoping for a financial settlement rather than actual legal victory. He'd always been more interested in easy money than justice, and threatening a wealthy man like James might seem like a promising way to extract payment for dropping his claims. "Sheriff," James said quietly, "may I ask who's encouraging Thomas to pursue these allegations? He's not smart enough or wealthy enough to mount this kind of challenge on his own." Morrison hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I can't reveal specific details about ongoing investigations, but I will say that Thomas has been seen in the company of certain individuals who have business differences with you, Mr. Blackwood." The implication was clear. James's enemies were using Thomas as a weapon against him, exploiting Margaret's vulnerable position to create legal and financial pressure. She felt sick at the thought of being used as a pawn in other people's schemes. "What can we do to protect Mrs. Whitfield's position here?" Eleanor asked practically. "Document everything," Morrison advised. "Her medical work, her compensation, her living conditions, her freedom of movement. If this goes to court, you'll want evidence that she's being treated as a valued employee and household member, not as an indentured servant." "I'll prepare a formal employment contract," James said immediately, "outlining Mrs. Whitfield's duties, compensation and rights. That should establish her legal status clearly." Margaret appreciated the gesture, but she also understood that paperwork might not be enough to protect her if powerful interests were determined to use her situation against James. The very qualities that made her valuable, her skills, her gratitude, her loyalty, could be twisted to suggest undue influence or exploitation. After Sheriff Morrison left, the three of them sat in contemplative silence, processing the implications of Thomas's legal challenge. The comfortable routine of ranch life suddenly felt fragile, threatened by forces beyond their immediate control. "I should leave," Margaret said finally. "Find another position somewhere far from here. Thomas can't challenge a transaction that no longer affects anyone." "No," James said firmly. "Running away won't solve anything, and it would only encourage our enemies to try similar tactics in the future. Besides," his voice softened, "you're family now, Mrs. Whitfield. We don't abandon our family when trouble comes calling." Eleanor nodded agreement. "The ranch needs you, Margaret, not just for medical care, but as part of what makes this place special. Don't let Thomas and his backers drive you away from your home." Their support touched Margaret deeply, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for the problems her presence was creating. James had built something magnificent here, and she couldn't bear the thought that her gratitude might somehow be used to destroy it. "What if we're fighting the wrong battle?" she asked thoughtfully. "What if instead of defending the auction arrangement, we simply move beyond it?" James raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The auction gave me a chance to find my place here, but that place isn't dependent on the legal technicalities of how I arrived. I'm a skilled medical practitioner providing valuable services to this community. My relationship to this ranch and this family is based on mutual respect and affection, not on any contract or purchase agreement." Eleanor's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're suggesting we change the narrative entirely." "Exactly. Instead of defending a controversial transaction, we emphasize the positive outcomes, the medical clinic, the lives saved, the services provided to the community. Let Thomas challenge an empty legal shell, while we build something substantial and lasting." James considered her words carefully. "It's a risky strategy. If we distance ourselves from the auction, we might be admitting it was improper. Or we might be demonstrating that whatever brought us together initially, what matters now is what we've built since then," Margaret countered. "The auction was a moment in time. Our relationship has grown far beyond those circumstances." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Henderson Ranch foreman, a weathered man in his 40s who'd been fighting a persistent cough for months. Margaret welcomed the distraction of medical work, leading him to her new clinic and focusing on the immediate, tangible problem of diagnosis and treatment. The examination revealed chronic bronchitis, probably caused by years of dust exposure during cattle drives. Margaret prescribed a regimen of steam treatments, herbal expectorants, and reduced exposure to dusty conditions. The foreman left with a supply of medicines and clear instructions for care, expressing gratitude for the thorough attention his condition had received. "First official patient in the new clinic," Eleanor observed as they watched the Henderson wagon depart. "First of many, I hope," Margaret replied. "Each person we help makes our position here stronger, more legitimate. Thomas can challenge the circumstances of my arrival, but he can't argue with the value of the work I'm doing." As evening approached, Margaret found herself walking the grounds of the ranch, thinking about the challenges ahead and the choices that had brought her to this place. The Montana sky stretched vast and star-filled overhead, unmarred by the smoke and dust of more crowded places. This was where she belonged, regardless of how she'd arrived here. James found her by the horse pasture, watching the animals graze in the fading light. "Regrets?" he asked gently. "About coming here?" "Never. About the complications my presence has created for you. Every day." Margaret turned to face him. "You've given me more than I ever dared hope for, James. A home, a purpose, a family. I won't let Thomas or anyone else take that away from us." "Then we fight," James said simply, "together. Whatever Thomas and his backers throw at us, we face it as a family, because that's what we are now, auction or no auction. You're my family, Mrs. Whitfield, and I protect my family." The determination in his voice was absolute, backed by wealth and power, but rooted in something deeper, the memory of a winter night when a stranger had risked everything to save 2 lives. That debt of gratitude had grown into something larger and more complex, a bond that couldn't be broken by legal challenges or social pressure. As they walked back toward the house, Margaret felt the strength that came from knowing she wasn't alone in whatever struggles lay ahead. The past might cast shadows, but the future remained bright with possibility. And if Thomas Whitfield wanted a fight, he was about to discover that the woman he'd sold for a handful of silver had found allies who wouldn't easily be intimidated or bought off. The storm clouds were gathering, but Blackwood Ranch had weathered storms before. This one would be no different. The storm arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, but it wasn't the kind that brought rain or snow to the Montana plains. This tempest came in the form of a black carriage, bearing territorial officials, followed by Thomas Whitfield on a borrowed horse, his face bearing the satisfied smirk of a man who believed he held winning cards. Margaret watched from her clinic window as the entourage approached the main house, her hands steady despite the anxiety coursing through her veins. She'd been expecting this confrontation for weeks, ever since Sheriff Morrison's visit, but the reality of it still sent a chill through her bones. "Mrs. Whitfield," Catherine Morrison called from the doorway, slightly out of breath from running. "Mr. Blackwood wants you in the parlor right away. Says to bring your medical records and any documentation of your work here." Margaret gathered the requested materials with practiced efficiency. Patient files, supply inventories, correspondence from grateful families, even testimonials from other doctors who'd consulted with her on difficult cases. The evidence of her value to the community filled a substantial leather portfolio, a tangible record of lives saved and suffering eased. The parlor was crowded when she arrived. James stood near the fireplace, his posture tense but controlled, while Eleanor sat at a small desk with a stenographer's notebook at the ready. 3 territorial officials occupied the sofa, 2 men in expensive suits and a stern-faced woman whose bearing suggested significant authority. Thomas lurked near the windows, avoiding Margaret's gaze but clearly savouring his moment of perceived triumph. "Mrs. Whitfield," the woman official said, rising respectfully as Margaret entered. "I'm Judge Patricia Hawthorne from the Territorial Capital. These are my colleagues, Mr. Daniels from the Territorial Attorney's Office and Mr. Stevens, our investigator. We're here to review the circumstances of your current arrangement and ensure that your rights and welfare are being properly protected." Margaret inclined her head politely. "Your Honor, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have." Judge Hawthorne was perhaps 50, with intelligent grey eyes and the kind of composed authority that came from years of making difficult decisions. Unlike the male officials, she seemed genuinely concerned with Margaret's welfare rather than merely going through legal motions. "Before we begin," the judge continued, "I want you to understand that this is not a trial or formal hearing. We're conducting a welfare assessment to determine whether territorial intervention is necessary to protect your interests. You're free to speak candidly, without fear of legal consequences." Thomas shifted impatiently near the window. "Your Honor, with respect, Mrs. Whitfield has been living under undue influence for months. She's hardly likely to speak freely in front of the man who bought her like livestock." Judge Hawthorne's sharp gaze fixed on Thomas with obvious displeasure. "Mr. Whitfield, you'll have your opportunity to present your concerns. For now, please, remain silent while I conduct this interview." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for the judge's firm handling of her nephew. "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I assure you that no intervention is necessary. I'm here by choice and am treated with complete respect and dignity. Tell me about your daily life here," Judge Hawthorne requested, settling back into her chair. "What are your responsibilities, your living conditions, your freedom of movement?" Margaret spoke clearly and confidently about her role as the ranch's medical practitioner, describing her clinic, her patients, and the satisfaction she found in meaningful work. She detailed her comfortable living quarters, her freedom to travel as needed, and her integration into the ranch community as a valued family member. Mr. Daniels, the territorial attorney, consulted his notes frequently as she spoke. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you compensated for your medical services?" "Yes. I receive a monthly salary of $50, plus all living expenses, medical supplies, and transportation as needed. I also keep a percentage of fees from patients who come from other ranches." Thomas snorted derisively. $50 to someone who cost $100. Sounds like exploitation to me. James's voice cut across the room like a blade. $50 is more than most doctors in small towns earn, Thomas. Plus room, board, and benefits that would cost twice that amount to obtain independently. Judge Hawthorne raised her hand for silence. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you feel that your compensation is fair?" "More than fair," Margaret replied honestly. "I've never earned as much in my life, nor lived in such comfort. But more importantly, I'm doing work that matters, using skills that were going to waste. The monetary compensation is secondary to the satisfaction of being truly useful again." The judge made notes in a small leather book. "And your relationship with Mr. Blackwood? How would you characterize it?" Margaret chose her words carefully, aware that any suggestion of impropriety could be twisted against them. "Mr. Blackwood treats me as an honored family member. He's respectful, generous, and protective of my welfare. Our relationship is based on mutual respect and shared purpose, the successful operation of this ranch and service to the community. Has he ever made any inappropriate demands or suggestions?" Mr. Stevens, the investigator, asked with the kind of leer that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Never," Margaret replied firmly. "Mr. Blackwood is a gentleman in every sense of the word. He's never been anything but proper and respectful in all our interactions." Thomas finally exploded with frustration. "Of course she's going to say that. She's been living in luxury for months, told what to say, how to act. She's probably terrified of being thrown out if she says anything negative. Judge Hawthorne's patience with Thomas was clearly wearing thin. Mr. Whitfield, what specific evidence do you have of coercion or mistreatment? Not speculation or assumption, but actual evidence. Thomas fumbled for words, his confidence beginning to crack. Well, she's not free to leave, is she? She's bound by the auction contract, property that was sold. Mrs. Whitfield, the judge said, turning back to Margaret, are you free to leave here if you choose? Have you ever been prevented from departing or threatened with consequences for leaving? I'm completely free to leave whenever I wish, Margaret stated clearly. Mr. Blackwood has made that explicitly clear on several occasions. I remain here because this is where I want to be, where my skills are valued and my life has meaning. James stepped forward with a document in his hand. Your Honor, I'd like to submit this formal employment contract, executed last week, which clearly establishes Mrs. Whitfield's status as a paid medical practitioner with full rights and freedoms. The auction transaction has been superseded by this legitimate business arrangement. Judge Hawthorne accepted the contract and read it carefully, her eyebrows rising slightly as she absorbed its generous terms. This is quite comprehensive. Mrs. Whitfield, did you negotiate these terms yourself, or were they presented to you as a fait accompli? I participated fully in their development, Margaret replied. Mr. Blackwood insisted that I review every clause and suggest modifications. The final terms exceed what I had hoped for. Mr. Daniels leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Mrs. Whitfield, surely you must have some complaints about your situation here, some aspect of your life that you'd like to see changed? Margaret considered the question seriously. I wish the circumstances that brought me here had been different. I wish my nephew had found another solution to his financial problems. But I have no complaints about my life here or my treatment by the Blackwood family. This has become my home in every sense that matters. What about your medical practice? Judge Hawthorne asked. I understand you're treating patients from throughout the region. Tell me about that work. Margaret's face lit up as she described her clinic and the patients she'd helped. She spoke about Billy Crawford's emergency appendectomy, the broken bones she'd set, the illnesses she'd diagnosed and treated. She pulled testimonial letters from her portfolio. Grateful families thanking her for saving loved ones, neighboring ranchers praising her skill and dedication. This letter is from Dr. Mitchell in Billings, Margaret said, offering a particularly impressive document. He's recommending me for formal medical certification based on the quality of my work and the outcomes achieved. Judge Hawthorne read the letter carefully, clearly impressed by the physician's strong endorsement. Dr. Mitchell has an excellent reputation. His recommendation carries significant weight. Thomas grew increasingly agitated as the interview progressed, and Margaret's responses undermined his allegations. Your Honor, you're not seeing the bigger picture here. This whole arrangement sets a dangerous precedent. How many other elderly women might be sold into similar situations? How many won't be as lucky as my aunt pretends to be? For the first time, Judge Hawthorne looked at Thomas with something approaching sympathy. Mr. Whitfield, your concern for the broader implications is noted. However, we're here to assess your aunt's specific situation, and frankly, she appears to be thriving. If you have evidence of actual harm or coercion, please present it. Otherwise, I see no grounds for territorial intervention. Margaret seized the moment to address the broader concerns. Your Honor, if I may, I think Thomas raises an important point about precedent. The practice of auctioning domestic arrangements is indeed problematic and should be restricted or eliminated, but invalidating existing arrangements that have produced positive outcomes would only harm the people those laws are meant to protect. What would you suggest as an alternative? The judge asked, clearly intrigued by Margaret's perspective. Focus future legislation on prevention and regulation rather than retroactive punishment. Require waiting periods, counseling services, legal representation for vulnerable parties. Establish standards for treatment and compensation, but allow existing arrangements that meet those standards to continue, especially when all parties are satisfied with the outcomes. Mr. Daniels looked surprised by her articulate policy recommendations. You've given this considerable thought, Mrs. Whitfield. I've had personal experience with both the problems and potential solutions, Margaret replied. I understand the vulnerability that leads to such desperate measures, but I also know that blanket condemnation could destroy legitimate relationships and harm the very people you're trying to protect. Judge Hawthorne closed her notebook with a decisive snap. Mrs. Whitfield, based on this interview and my observation of your circumstances, I see no evidence that territorial intervention is warranted in your case. You appear to be living freely, working meaningfully, and thriving in your current environment. Thomas's face went white with shock and fury. This is a travesty. You're ignoring the fundamental injustice of the situation. Mr. Whitfield, the judge said with icy politeness, I'm addressing the actual welfare of your aunt, not your theoretical concerns about social justice. Mrs. Whitfield is clearly capable of speaking for herself and making her own decisions. If you're genuinely concerned about her welfare, perhaps you should focus on rebuilding the family relationship you damaged through your own poor choices. The rebuke hit Thomas like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to realize that further argument would only make his position worse. With a look of venomous hatred directed at both Margaret and James, he stalked from the room. Before we conclude, Judge Hawthorne said, I'd like to tour your medical facilities, Mrs. Whitfield. Dr. Mitchell's letter mentions a well-equipped clinic, and I'm curious to see it for myself. The tour of Margaret's clinic clearly impressed all three officials. The clean, well-lit space, the quality of the medical equipment, and the detailed patient records demonstrated both James's investment in proper facilities and Margaret's professional competence. When they discovered that she was treating patients from multiple ranches and had become the de facto regional medical provider, their respect for her achievement was obvious. This is quite remarkable, Judge Hawthorne said as they concluded. The tour. You've essentially established a frontier medical practice that serves an entire region. The Territorial Medical Board would be interested in reviewing your work for potential certification. I'd welcome that opportunity, Margaret replied. Formal recognition would certainly strengthen my position and credibility. As the officials prepared to depart, Judge Hawthorne took Margaret aside for a private word. Mrs. Whitfield, I want you to know that you have legal recourse if your situation here ever deteriorates. The territorial government takes the welfare of its citizens seriously, regardless of how they arrived at their current circumstances. Thank you, Your Honor, but I'm confident that won't be necessary. I found my place in the world, and it's here. After the officials departed, Margaret, James, and Eleanor gathered in the parlor to process what had just occurred. The relief was palpable. Thomas's challenge had not only failed, but had actually strengthened Margaret's legal position and professional standing. I can't believe Thomas thought that performance would be convincing, Eleanor said, shaking her head in amazement. He came across as petty and vindictive, not concerned for your welfare. He was probably promised money by whoever put him up to this, James said grimly. When they realize his challenge failed, they'll likely abandon him to face the consequences of his actions alone. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the immediate threat was over, but sadness that her nephew had chosen greed and resentment over family loyalty. I hope this is the end of it. I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. It's over, James said with conviction, Judge Hawthorne's assessment will carry significant weight with territorial authorities. Anyone thinking of challenging your position here will have to contend with official recognition of your legitimate status. As evening fell over the ranch, Margaret stood once again in her clinic, surrounded by the tools and supplies of her trade. The morning's confrontation had tested everything she'd built here, but she'd emerged stronger and more secure than ever. The past had finally released its hold on her, allowing her to step fully into the future she'd created through skill, determination, and the kindness of those who'd become her true family. The baby she'd saved in a blizzard 23 years ago had grown into a man who understood the value of loyalty and protection. Together, they'd weathered the storm of legal challenge and social pressure. Now, with that behind them, they could focus on building the kind of life and legacy that would honor the memory of Sarah Blackwood and all the other souls who'd found shelter in acts of simple human kindness. The reckoning was over. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility and grounded in the unshakable foundation of family, purpose, and home. Spring arrived early on the Blackwood Ranch in 1924, 6 months after Judge Hawthorne's decisive ruling had secured Margaret's place in the world she'd helped build. The Montana landscape burst with new life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, cattle grazed on rich green grass, and the air carried the sweet scent of possibility that came with changing seasons. Margaret stood on the front porch of the main house, watching as a new addition took shape beside her medical clinic. The construction crew worked with quiet efficiency, their hammers ringing out a steady rhythm as they framed what would become the territory's first certified frontier medical training facility. The Territorial Medical Board, impressed by Margaret's work and Judge Hawthorne's recommendation, had approved funding for a formal school where experienced practitioners could train the next generation of frontier doctors and nurses. "The foundation's nearly complete," James said, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Another month, and you'll be ready to welcome your first class of students." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, marveling at how natural such moments had become. The easy companionship between them had deepened over the months since Thomas's failed challenge, built on shared purpose and mutual respect that needed no formal definition. Dr. Mitchell confirmed yesterday that he'll be teaching the surgical procedures course, Margaret reported, and we've received applications from 12 students, 6 men and 6 women, all with previous medical experience seeking formal certification. The prospect excited Margaret more than she cared to admit. Teaching had always appealed to her, and the opportunity to pass on 4 decades of hard-won medical knowledge felt like the natural culmination of her career. The students would come from across the territory, drawn by the promise of practical training under conditions that closely mirrored their future practice environments. "Any word from the territorial capital about the new legislation?" James asked, settling into the rocking chair beside hers. Margaret nodded, pulling a letter from her apron pocket. "Judge Hawthorne wrote personally. The Domestic Arrangements Protection Act passed last week. It establishes waiting periods, mandatory legal representation, and welfare standards for anyone considering such arrangements. But as we suggested, existing arrangements that meet the new standards are grandfathered in, so Thomas's challenge actually helped create better protections for vulnerable people. Ironic, isn't it? His selfish motives ended up producing genuine reform." Margaret sipped her coffee thoughtfully. Judge Hawthorne also mentioned that 3 other territories are considering similar legislation, using our law as a model. The morning was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar wagon. Billy Crawford, fully recovered from his appendectomy and now serving as the ranch's official medical transport driver, bringing their first patient of the day. Margaret smiled as she recognized the passenger, Mrs. Rebecca Patterson, from the Triple Bar Ranch, heavily pregnant with her 4th child and clearly in the early stages of labor. "Mrs. Whitfield," Billy called out, helping Rebecca down from the wagon with gentle care. Mrs. Patterson's been having pains since before dawn. Her husband sent me to fetch you as quickly as I could. Margaret was already moving, her medical instincts taking over. Bring her to the clinic, Billy. Rebecca, how far apart are the contractions? About 10 minutes after we left the ranch, Rebecca gasped, one hand pressed to her lower back. But they're getting stronger. This baby doesn't want to wait much longer. Margaret's clinic had become the region's unofficial birthing center over the past months, as word spread about her skill with difficult deliveries and the clean, well-equipped facility James had provided. She has delivered 17 babies since the clinic opened, with no losses and minimal complications, a record that would have been impressive even in a city hospital. "Eleanor," Margaret called as they reached the clinic. "I'll need hot water, clean linens, and my birthing kit. This one's coming fast." The next 3 hours passed in the focused intensity that Margaret had come to love about birthing work. Rebecca's labor progressed normally but quickly, and by early afternoon the clinic echoed with the strong cry of a healthy baby girl. Margaret cleaned and examined the infant with practiced hands, noting the pink skin and strong reflexes that indicated excellent health. "She's perfect," Margaret announced, wrapping the baby in a soft blanket before placing her in Rebecca's arms. 8 pounds if she's an ounce, and clearly blessed with her father's lungs. Rebecca's exhausted face glowed with joy as she examined her daughter. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. I don't know what we'd do without you out here. The nearest doctor is 30 miles away, and he's never delivered a baby in his life." "That's exactly why we're building the medical school," Margaret replied, checking Rebecca's condition and noting the healthy color returning to her cheeks. "In a few years, there will be qualified medical practitioners throughout the territory, trained specifically for frontier conditions." As Rebecca rested and bonded with her new daughter, Margaret stepped outside to find James waiting with obvious concern. The sight of her emerging with a smile told him everything he needed to know. "Mother and baby both doing well?" he asked. "Perfectly. Rebecca's a strong woman, and the delivery went smoothly. They'll rest here for a few hours before Billy takes them home." Margaret pulled off her apron and washed her hands in the basin by the clinic door. "That's the 3rd baby this month. Word is definitely spreading about the clinic. You've created something remarkable here," James said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. "When I bought you at that auction, I thought I was simply repaying an old debt. I never imagined you'd transform this entire region's approach to medical care." The mention of the auction no longer carried the sting it once had. That desperate day in Cedar Ridge had become simply the starting point of Margaret's real life, the moment when fate and kindness had conspired to place her where she truly belonged. "Your mother would be proud," Margaret said softly. "Everything we've built here, the clinic, the school, the community we've helped heal, it all stems from that winter night when she refused to give up hope." James nodded, his pale eyes distant with memory. "She always said that kindness was like seeds scattered on the wind. You never knew where they'd take root and what they'd grow into." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another wagon, this one carrying an unexpected passenger. Sheriff Morrison climbed down with obvious stiffness, favoring his left leg in a way that suggested recent injury. "Sheriff," Margaret said, immediately shifting into medical mode, "what happened to your leg?" "Horse threw me 3 days ago," Morrison admitted sheepishly. "Landed wrong and twisted something fierce. Wife finally convinced me to come see you when I couldn't make it up the courthouse steps this morning." Margaret helped him into the clinic, noting the way he held his weight and the slight swelling around his ankle. A careful examination revealed a sprained ankle and strained muscles, painful but not serious. "You'll need to stay off it for at least a week," Margaret instructed as she wrapped the ankle with a supportive bandage. "I'll give you some willow bark tea for the pain, and you should elevate it whenever possible." "A week?" Morrison protested. "I can't be laid up that long. We've got county business to attend to." "Sheriff," Margaret said with the firm tone she'd perfected over decades of dealing with stubborn patients, "if you don't rest that ankle properly now, you'll be dealing with chronic problems for years to come. Is there someone who can handle your duties temporarily?" Morrison sighed in defeat. "My deputy can manage most things, and I suppose the county won't collapse if I spend a few days with my feet up." As Margaret prepared his pain medication, Morrison brought up a subject she'd been wondering about. "Mrs. Whitfield, have you heard anything about Thomas lately?" "Nothing since the territorial hearing," Margaret replied. "I assumed he'd left the area after his plans fell through." "He did, but not quietly. Word is he made some threats about getting even with you and Mr. Blackwood before he rode out. Might be nothing, but I thought you should know." Margaret felt a familiar chill of apprehension. She'd hoped Thomas's humiliation would end his interest in her affairs, but apparently his resentment ran deeper than she'd realized. "What kind of threats?" James asked, having overheard the conversation from the doorway. "Nothing specific enough to act on legally," Morrison admitted. "But he was drinking heavily and talking about how people shouldn't be allowed to profit from other people's misery. Could be just whiskey talk, but we'll be careful anyway," James finished. "Thank you for the warning, Sheriff." After Morrison left with his pain medication and strict instructions for rest, Margaret found herself troubled by the news about Thomas. She'd thought that chapter of her life was closed, but apparently some wounds festered rather than healing. "Don't worry about Thomas," James said, correctly reading her expression. "He's proven himself to be all bluster and no substance. Besides, Judge Hawthorne's ruling gave you legal protections he can't challenge." "I'm not worried about legal challenges," Margaret replied. "I'm worried about what a desperate, angry man might do when he feels he has nothing left to lose." Their concerns proved prophetic when, 3 days later, Billy Crawford arrived at the ranch in a state of high agitation. He'd been in town picking up medical supplies when he overheard a disturbing conversation in the saloon. "Mrs. Whitfield," Billy said, his young face tight with worry, "there's men in town asking questions about you and Mr. Blackwood. Strangers, not from around here. They're wanting to know about your daily routines when you travel to other ranches. Whether you're ever alone." Margaret felt her blood turn cold. The implications were clear. Someone was planning something that required detailed knowledge of her movements and vulnerabilities. "What did these men look like?" James asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Hard men," Billy replied. "The kind you see in mining camps and cattle towns, men who sell their guns to whoever pays best. One of them mentioned Thomas Whitfield by name and said they had business to conclude for him." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. "We should send word to Sheriff Morrison immediately, and perhaps keep Margaret close to the ranch until we know more about these men's intentions." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I won't be driven into hiding by Thomas's hired thugs. Too many people depend on the medical services I provide. We'll take precautions, but I won't abandon my responsibilities." James studied her with admiration and concern. "Then we'll make sure you're never alone when you travel. Frank can assign men to escort you to other ranches, and will vary your routes and schedules to make you a harder target." Over the following weeks, life on the Blackwood Ranch took on a subtle tension, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Margaret continued her medical rounds, but always with armed escorts. The clinic remained busy with patients from across the region, but extra security measures were quietly implemented. James increased the number of men working near the main compound, and Eleanor made sure someone was always within earshot of Margaret's activities. The attack, when it came, was both sudden and surprisingly inept. Margaret was returning from a Successful delivery at the Henderson Ranch, accompanied by two of James's most trusted men, when three armed riders emerged from a stand of cottonwood trees beside the road. "That's far enough," one of the gunmen called out, leveling a rifle at their wagon. "We want the woman. No one needs to get hurt if you just hand her over peaceful-like." Margaret's escorts reacted with the swift efficiency of men accustomed to danger. Frank Morrison, the ranch foreman, dropped from the wagon seat while drawing his pistol, using the vehicle for cover. His companion, a steady man named Pete Williams, aimed his rifle at the mounted gunman while keeping his body between them and Margaret. "You boys picked the wrong target," Frank called out calmly. "Mrs. Whitfield is under the protection of the Blackwood Ranch, and we don't give up our own hired guns." The lead gunman's confidence wavered as he realized his quarry wasn't going to be taken easily. "Thomas Whitfield paid us good money to bring his aunt back to him. Says she's being held against her will." "Thomas Whitfield is a liar and a fool," Margaret said clearly, standing up in the wagon despite Pete's attempts to keep her down. "I'm here by my own choice, doing work that matters. Whatever he's paying you isn't worth dying for." The standoff stretched taut for several heartbeats, neither side willing to make the first move that would turn tension into violence. Then the sound of approaching hoofbeats resolved the situation. James and 6 of his men appeared around a bend in the road, having followed at a distance as additional security. Faced with overwhelming odds, the hired guns chose discretion over valor. They wheeled their horses around and fled toward the territorial border, leaving behind only dust and the echo of their horses' hooves. "Are you hurt?" James asked, dismounting quickly and approaching the wagon with obvious concern. "I'm fine," Margaret assured him, though her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline of the encounter. "More angry than frightened, really. Thomas just won't let this go." "Yes, he will," James said with cold certainty, "because this was his last chance to cause trouble, and he wasted it on incompetent help. Word of this attack will reach Sheriff Morrison and the territorial authorities. There will be warrants issued, and Thomas will find himself a wanted man." The prediction proved accurate. Within a week, territorial marshals had arrested the 3 gunmen, who quickly implicated Thomas as the man who'd hired them. Thomas himself had fled toward the Canadian border, but warrants for his arrest had been issued throughout the territory. His schemes had finally collapsed under the weight of their own criminality. "It's over," Eleanor said, as they received news of the warrants. "Thomas has made himself a fugitive. Even if he's never caught, he can't show his face in Montana again." Margaret felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the threat was ended, but sadness that her nephew had chosen such a destructive path. "I hope he finds some peace wherever he ends up. Hatred is a poison that hurts the person carrying it more than anyone else." As summer deepened into autumn, life on the Blackwood Ranch settled into new rhythms of prosperity and purpose. Margaret's medical school welcomed its first class of students, 12 dedicated individuals, who worked alongside her during the day and studied by lamplight in the evenings. The sight of young people learning to heal and help others filled Margaret with a satisfaction deeper than any she'd known. Billy Crawford, fully recovered and inspired by his experience as a patient, became one of the first students to enroll. His natural compassion and steady hands made him a promising candidate for certification as a frontier medical practitioner. "Mrs. Whitfield," Billy said one evening as he practiced suturing techniques under her guidance, "I keep thinking about how different my life would be if you hadn't been here when I got hurt. Makes me want to be that person for someone else someday." "That's exactly the right attitude," Margaret replied, checking his work with approval. "Medicine isn't just about technical skill. It's about being present when people need help most, about choosing compassion over convenience." The conversation was interrupted by Maria Santos, who appeared in the clinic doorway with obvious excitement. "Senora Margaret, come quick. There is a surprise for you at the main house." Puzzled, Margaret followed Maria through the gathering. Dusk to the ranch house, where she found the parlor filled with familiar faces. Dr. Mitchell from Billings was there, along with Judge Hawthorne, Sheriff Morrison, and representatives from several ranches where Margaret had provided medical care. Eleanor stood near the fireplace with a large wrapped package, while James waited with an expression of barely contained anticipation. "What's all this?" Margaret asked, genuinely bewildered by the gathering. Judge Hawthorne stepped forward with an official-looking document in her hands. "Mrs. Margaret Whitfield, by order of the Territorial Medical Board and in recognition of your exceptional service to the communities of Montana Territory, you are hereby awarded full medical certification as a frontier practitioner." Margaret's hand shook as she accepted the certificate, reading her name printed in elegant script beneath the territorial seal. After 40 years of practicing medicine without formal recognition, she was finally, officially, a doctor. "That's not all," Dr. Mitchell added with a smile. "The Territorial Medical Board has also approved your application to establish the Whitfield Institute for Frontier Medicine as an official territorial medical school. You'll be the first woman in Montana to serve as the director of a medical institution." The gathered crowd erupted in applause as Margaret struggled to process the magnitude of what was happening. Not only had she achieved professional recognition, but she would be leading an institution that bore her name, a legacy that would outlast her own lifetime. "There's one more thing," James said, stepping forward with the wrapped package from Eleanor. "This is from all of us, a token of our appreciation for everything you've brought to our lives." Margaret unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "The Whitfield Institute for Frontier Medicine, founded 1924, where healing begins." Below the text, an artist had carved an intricate relief showing a woman tending to patients against a backdrop of Montana. "Mountains, it's beautiful," Margaret whispered, tracing the carved letters of her name with trembling fingers. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep doing what you're doing," Sheriff Morrison replied. "This territory needs people like you, Mrs. Whitfield. People who choose to build rather than tear down, who see possibilities where others see only problems." As the celebration continued around her, Margaret found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she'd stood on an auction block in Cedar Ridge, her future uncertain and her dignity in tatters. Tonight, she was surrounded by people who valued her skills and respected her contributions, in a place where her work would continue long after she was gone. The baby she'd saved in a blizzard had grown into a man who understood the true meaning of gratitude, not as a debt to be repaid, but as a foundation for building something larger and more meaningful than either of them could have achieved alone. "James," Margaret said quietly, finding him standing apart from the crowd as the evening wound down. "I need you to know something. That night, I fought through the storm to reach your soddy. I didn't do it expecting any reward or recognition. I did it because it was right, because your mother and you needed help." "I know," James replied softly. "That's exactly why what you did mattered so much. True kindness doesn't expect anything in return. But sometimes, if we're very lucky, life finds a way to honor that kindness anyway." Margaret nodded, understanding finally that the miraculous transformation of her life wasn't really about luck or coincidence. It was about the simple truth that kindness, once given freely, has a way of multiplying and returning in forms we never expect. As the guests departed and the ranch settled into peaceful silence, Margaret stood once more on the front porch, looking out at the land she'd come to love. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new students, new opportunities to heal and teach and build. The Whitfield Institute would train dozens of medical practitioners who would scatter across the frontier, carrying with them the skills and compassion she'd spent a lifetime developing. In the distance, she could see lights in the windows of the student dormitory, where 12 dedicated young people studied by lamplight. preparing for lives of service and healing. Each of them would touch hundreds of lives, and some of those lives would be inspired to follow similar paths. The ripples of kindness would spread outward in ways she could never fully track or comprehend. "Thank you, Sarah," Margaret whispered to the star-filled Montana sky, speaking to the memory of James's mother. "Thank you for raising a son who remembers his debts and knows how to honor them." A gentle breeze stirred the autumn air, carrying the scents of grass and wildflowers and the promise of winter's approach. But Margaret felt only warmth as she contemplated the legacy she was building. Not in stone or gold, but in lives saved, skills taught, and kindness perpetuated across generations. The auction block was far behind her now, transformed into a stepping stone rather than a place of shame. What mattered wasn't how she'd arrived at this moment, but what she'd built since then, and what would remain after she was gone. Margaret Clare Whitfield had found her place in the world, and the world was better for it. The seeds of kindness planted on a winter night 24 years ago had grown into a forest of healing that would shelter countless souls for generations to come. As she turned to go inside, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the window. Glass, an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple dress and a satisfied smile. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who had found her purpose and fulfilled it completely. The baby she'd saved had indeed repaid his debt, but in the process he'd given her something far more valuable than money or security. He'd given her the chance to become the person she was always meant to be, a healer, a teacher, a builder of hope, in a world that sorely needed all three. Margaret Whitfield walked into her home with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, and a legacy assured. Behind her, the Montana night stretched vast and star-filled, holding infinite possibilities for tomorrow and all the tomorrows yet to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.